Sherlock Holmes, The Case of the Magnate's Son, being a reprint from the diary of Mrs. Mary Watson, née Morstan. Written by R.A. Dodson, digitally narrated by ElevenLabs. Chapter 1. An excerpt from the diary of Mary Watson. As May of 1889 draws to a close, I must commit to paper the events of the past few days while they are still fresh in my memory, for I fear that the tale of tragedy and human failing is too serious and too disturbing to become part of my husband John's memoirs. He has his notes, of course, as he has for all of the cases during which he has accompanied his singular friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, but he has not the heart to spin them into a story, for many aspects of the affair continue to trouble him deeply. The tale began innocently enough when my former employer, Mrs. Cecil Forrester, invited me to take tea with her. I accepted eagerly, as I had not seen her in some weeks. During my years of employment with her as a governess, Mrs. Forrester showed me every kindness. She has been as close to a mother to me as any person could be, my own mother having died when I was very small. On this particular afternoon she welcomed me warmly, and we spoke for some time of pleasant trivialities related to her children and my recent marriage. Eventually, though, she sobered. "Whatever is the matter?" I asked.
"I fear that I have had some ulterior motives in inviting you here today, my dear,"
she said.
"A friend of my husband is undergoing some very trying circumstances."
"I'm terribly sorry to hear that," I replied. "If there is anything I can do, please don't hesitate to ask."
"I hope that there is," she began. "The gentleman's name is Mr. Henry Waterford. He and his wife Olivia moved here with their young daughter from Manchester in '87. He made his fortune in the cotton industry there, as I understand it. In fact, I believe you met them once briefly, when they came to call shortly before that business with the Agra treasure."
"The name does sound familiar," I said.
"The family lives quietly for the most part, but just recently Mrs. Waterford has begun receiving the most disturbing letters, horrible, threatening missives that have sent her nearly out of her mind with worry."
"How terrible!" I exclaimed.
"The poor woman's nerves have been completely shattered,"
Mrs. Forrester continued.
"And no wonder. She has just recently recovered from a very difficult pregnancy, the poor dear. She gave birth only weeks ago. The child, though weak, seemed to be gaining strength and health, and now this."
"Who would send such dreadful letters to a new mother?" I asked.
"That is what I hope you can help them to discover. I promised Mr. Waterford that I would ask you to bring the case before your husband in hopes that he might gain the assistance of Mr. Sherlock Holmes in bringing the author of the letters to light. I'm sure Mr. Waterford would be willing to pay handsomely to have the matter brought to a successful conclusion."
"I will certainly do so, though from what I know of Mr. Holmes, I dare say the promise of monetary reward does not hold so much sway with him as does the mystery behind the threats," I said.
"As long as he agrees to help, the reason does not matter,"
said Mrs. Forrester.
"It pains me to see Henry in such a state. He's a good man with a growing family, and the situation is wearing him down dreadfully."
"I can only imagine that it must be," I said, sipping my tea. "Well, if anyone can shed light on the subject, it's Mr. Holmes. I'm certain he'll be willing to help." After returning to more pleasant topics of conversation, Mrs. Forrester and I spent an enjoyable afternoon together. Eventually, I excused myself to return home and oversee the preparation of supper. John's medical practice had been bustling of late, so it was no surprise to find that he was not yet home from his rounds. When he finally arrived, tired but jovial, I took his coat and hat before sitting him down in front of a steaming plate of lamb, potatoes, and spring greens. When he had finished most of what was in front of him, I passed on Mrs. Forrester's request. He frowned, and it was not difficult to read his outrage that anyone would threaten a respectable woman with a newborn babe in such a way. My husband has always been chivalrous to a fault.
"Of course we'll help,"
he said.
"I'll wire Holmes with the particulars straight away. I know he's been heavily in demand as of late, but I'm confident that he will accept such a request from a friend."
The next morning, we received a terse message from Mr. Holmes in response, inviting us to join him at his Baker Street lodgings the following day at 1 p.m. John and I arrived a few minutes early to find the detective still in his dressing gown, smoking his pipe, absorbed in the agony columns, and with an untouched plate of sandwiches next to his elbow.
"Ah, my dear Doctor and Mrs. Watson, do come in,"
he exclaimed, rising to his feet.
"So glad that both of you could make it."
I must interject at this point that Mr. Sherlock Holmes has always been unfailingly polite to me, since the very first time we met, when I engaged his services in the case John calls The Sign of the Four. However, his charming yet distant manner has never quite disabused me of the impression that, by falling in love with John and marrying him, I had unknowingly broken something that he considered precious and irreplaceable. It is this feeling which leads me to press John to accompany Mr. Holmes on cases at every opportunity, even when it takes him away from my side, sometimes for days at a time, and even when it occasionally puts him in harm's way.
"I was just about to ready myself for the arrival of Mr. Waterford,"
the detective continued, disappearing into his bedroom.
"Do help yourself to sandwiches."
Accustomed as he was to his friend's bohemian ways, John pulled out a chair for me and seated himself, offering me a sandwich, which I declined with a smile. Mr. Holmes's voice rang out from the other room.
"So, Watson, I take it Thurston is feeling better after his recent illness."
I felt rather than heard John let out a somewhat long-suffering sigh next to me. Though I had seen a handful of such demonstrations of Mr. Holmes' powers of deduction, I certainly did not have the same long-standing familiarity with the habit as my husband. Intrigued, I called out, "Good heavens, Mr. Holmes, how could you possibly know that?" The detective emerged from his room the picture of respectability, with a dark, well-cut coat and his hair slicked back neatly.
"A trifling matter, Mrs. Watson, I assure you,"
he said in a dismissive tone. "Nonetheless, I should be interested to hear the explanation," I said, allowing my curiosity to show clearly in my expression.
"Very well,"
he said.
"Watson, you will recall that a week ago you mentioned that Thurston had promised to finally return your copy of Burns' poetry when you saw him next at the club, after keeping it on loan for far too long a time. You only play billiards at the club with Thurston on Wednesdays. Forgive me, my dear chap, but you always were a creature of habit, even before your marriage."
I hid a smile at this, for it was most assuredly the case.
"Today is a Saturday,"
he continued,
"and yet I see the top edge of the small tome in question peeking from your coat pocket. Ergo, something kept Thurston from his usual outing to the club on Wednesday, but you have just lunched with him before coming here, and in doing so, regained your long-borrowed copy of Burns. That Thurston was ill on Wednesday was admittedly a piece of conjecture, but not, I believe you will agree, an unlikely one given the plague of sniffles and fevers currently enveloping the city."
"Bravo, Mr. Holmes," I said. "That was marvellous. Every word is true." John smiled fondly at me, but Mr. Holmes waved my words away.
"As I said, a trifle,"
he reiterated.
"Now, though, I do believe I hear our Mr. Waterford upon the stairway, and I imagine that you would both wish to be present for the interview."
Indeed, at that moment, a knock came upon the door.
"Come in,"
called Mr. Holmes, and shook hands with the slender, brown-haired gentleman who entered.
"Mr. Henry Waterford, I presume. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson, and his wife, Mrs. Mary Watson, who was good enough to bring your case to my attention at the behest of her friend and former employer, Mrs. Cecil Forrester. Now pray take a seat and tell me all that has happened."
"Good afternoon, Dr. Watson, Mrs. Watson,"
said Mr. Waterford politely, seating himself in the comfortable chair that the detective indicated. The gentleman was pleasant-looking but careworn. It was obvious that recent events were weighing heavily on his shoulders. I should place him at around 40 years of age, or maybe 45, and his rich, broad voice spoke eloquently of his northern upbringing. Doubtless, Mr. Holmes's sharp gaze uncovered several additional facts that were hidden from me, but the detective kept his counsel, sitting back in his overstuffed chair and peering at Mr. Waterford over steepled fingers.
"This situation is this, Mr. Holmes,"
he continued.
"My wife and I moved here from Manchester 2 years ago. We have no ties in London other than those friends we have made during that time, and, up until a week ago, I would have said that we had no enemies, nor anyone who would say a bad word against us. Then last Sunday evening, a piece of paper was left pinned to our front door. The note accused my wife of being a thief, which is utterly ridiculous, and called her a liar. A second note appeared during the night on Tuesday, and one of the servants discovered it on Wednesday morning. It continued in more or less the same vein, accusing her of theft and stating, "You have wronged me." A third and final note was found on Friday morning. It was positively threatening in both tone and language. "I'm sure you can imagine that my wife is terrified. As you may have heard, her health was already in something of a delicate condition."
She recently gave birth.
Mr. Holmes asked.
"Yes, a baby boy, born 2 weeks ago tomorrow."
Holmes leaned forward.
Do you have these letters with you?
"Only the last one.
Said Mr. Waterford.
I destroyed the first 2 immediately after receiving them."
That is very unfortunate.
Said Mr. Holmes severely.
Pray, let me see the one you do have.
Mr. Waterford pulled the folded square of paper from his inner pocket and passed it to the detective, who took it eagerly. He sniffed the paper and opened it before pulling out a small magnifier and examining it minutely on both sides. When he was done, he handed it to John, who smoothed it out on the edge of the table so we could both read it. The paper was coarse, not at all like normal stationery, and the ink was smudged in a couple of places. In ugly block capitals was printed, "Mrs. Give back what you have stole from us, or I will take it from you by force." Chapter 2. I couldn't help the little shiver that ran through me at the words. John placed his hand over mine reassuringly.
And no one has seen the person who left these singular missives?
Mr. Holmes asked.
After the second note, I ordered one of the page boys to watch the door at night, but he fell asleep and saw nothing when the third one was left.
Said Mr. Holmes pensively.
There's not much to go on. Aside from the fact that the author is left-handed, has a bad temper, and works at a butcher shop, I can determine little at this time.
"How—"
began Mr. Waterford.
Oh, tut, I should have thought it was obvious.
Said the detective.
The note is written on clean, unused butcher's paper. The smudges show where the side of the writer's left hand has brushed over the still wet ink as he wrote, and I think the content of the note makes it fairly apparent that this person is prone to high passion. If a more even-tempered individual were to feel that they had been the victim of theft, by a woman no less, the rational response would be to go to the police, not skulk around leaving threatening notes in the middle of the night.
Yes, I see,"
said Mr. Waterford.
"You're quite right, of course."
At any rate, if your mysterious note writer stays true to form, you may receive another missive tonight. Perhaps the page boy will be more wakeful this time around and catch a glimpse of him. If nothing else, you should have the servant send any new notes directly to me.
"You will not come down yourself?"
Asked Mr. Waterford.
Unfortunately, it is quite impossible.
Said Mr. Holmes.
I am engaged on 3 other cases at the moment, 2 of which require my utmost concentration for the next few days. Indeed, the best advice I can give you is to take your wife and children on a trip to the countryside for a little while, until I can gather enough evidence to make sense of your situation.
Mr. Waterford bristled visibly.
"Leave London. I'll not be driven from my own home by some filthy blackguard who's too cowardly even to show his face."
Nonetheless, that is my recommendation.
Said Mr. Holmes.
If you refuse to take your family away from the city, then I at least implore you to take every precaution for your safety, and the safety of your wife and children.
"You think there is real danger, then?"
Asked Mr. Waterford.
I do not have enough information to determine whether there is danger or not. I merely think that it would be wise not to discount the possibility.
"Well, I will take what you have to say under consideration, though it really is not feasible for us to leave right now,"
said the man grudgingly.
"If any new evidence comes to light, I will send it to you immediately. Now, if that is all, I must return home. Good day to you all."
We rose as Mr. Waterford nodded stiffly and took his leave. "How foolish!" I exclaimed after the door had closed and the sound of footsteps faded.
"And yet,"
said my husband,
"I can understand the desire not to flee from one's own home on the strength of a few angry notes."
I wonder, old friend, if you would still feel that way with a young daughter and a 2-week-old infant son under your care.
Said Mr. Holmes, and I felt John's hand steal up to cut my elbow as the words hit home.
And now, if you don't mind, I'll take a little time to myself to ponder the particulars of this case, which does, after all, have a couple of points to recommend it.
John raised a sardonic eyebrow and led me to the door as Mr. Holmes sat back and lit his pipe.
Come along, Mary,
he said, shooting a pointed glance toward his friend, who already seemed oblivious to our presence.
I think it's clear that we're both surplus to requirements at this point, don't you?
We heard nothing more until the following Monday, when a lad delivered a short message from Mr. Holmes to our front door. John was away on a call to attend old Mr. Sutherland, whose pneumonia had taken a turn for the worse that morning, so I received the note myself. "Serious developments in the Waterford case," it read. "Will call at 3 p.m. to discuss." It was closer to 3:30 when the bell rang, and the maid announced Mr. Holmes's presence. I bade her show him to the drawing-room, where I received him and apologized for John's absence. "What has happened?" I asked. "Your note indicated there had been developments." He shook his head almost angrily.
It's a case of kidnapping now,
he said.
The infant was taken from his nurse at knife point early this morning. Really, this could not have come at a worse time. The DeLong jewel case is at a critical point and may fall apart completely if I am unable to make the final connections before the auction in 2 days.
I sat down heavily upon hearing the news, imagining how poor Mr. and Mrs. Waterford must be feeling. "He should have heeded your warnings," I said faintly. Mr. Holmes was fairly crackling with energy and irritation. He began pacing back and forth.
Yes, he should have, but he didn't, and there's no help for it now,
he said.
I believe I hear your husband's beleaguered footsteps along the hall. Watson, do come in and join us.
Holmes,
exclaimed John as he entered.
What brings you round to visit us?
I saw Mr. Holmes's eyes rake over John quickly, assessing.
I'm afraid I have unpleasant news to add to your already trying day, old friend,
he said.
I perceive that you have lost a patient this afternoon, through no fault of your own, I might add.
In this particular case, I could have made the same deduction based on my husband's expression and the weary slump of his shoulders, but John's brow furrowed in puzzlement as he looked back at his friend.
How? No, never mind. You're right, of course. Richard Sutherland was elderly, but I really thought he would be able to pull through this bout of pneumonia. Sadly, I was wrong, and I left the household in mourning. Now, though, do tell me what news has brought you here.
It's this Waterford case,
Holmes said, some of his earlier asperity returning.
The couple's infant has been kidnapped from its pram.
John thumped down into his own chair, mirroring my reaction from earlier.
Good grief,
he said.
The villain.
Assuming the incident is related to the earlier letters, and the content of the letters is suggestive, this complicates things immensely. I already have too many things which require my attention over the next 24 hours. But of course, the safety of a child trumps the monetary misfortunes of the aristocracy.
My dear chap,
said John,
I am yours to command if I can be of any help.
As always, I bit back any objections I might have had, considering John's obvious exhaustion after a day spent fighting unsuccessfully for the life of an old man. Based on the many times I had seen my husband come to life during the adventure, and yes, danger, involved in one of Mr. Holmes' cases, I knew my protective reaction to be an emotional one, not a rational one. Indeed, even now I saw him revive somewhat at the prospect of doing something positive to help secure the recovery of the kidnapped infant.
I am pleased to hear it, Doctor,
Mr. Holmes replied.
If I may prevail upon you and your wife, I have tasks for both of you.
For me as well? I asked, seeing my own surprise reflected in my husband's face.
Indeed,
said the detective.
Watson, would you be so good as to interview Mrs. Waterford and the nurse? They have already given the particulars to the police, but I would much prefer to have a few additional questions put to them by someone I trust.
Of course,
said John.
But Holmes, what is it that you intend to ask of Mary?
Holmes looked at me directly, his sharp grey eyes appraising me with a frank gaze.
Mrs. Watson, I would like you to enter the Waterfords' employ temporarily as a governess for their older daughter. No doubt there has been some considerable disruption of the household after recent events, and they would be glad of the assistance.
If you think it would help, then I'm happy to place myself at their disposal, I said.
I think it would be a very great help,
Mr. Holmes replied.
I have an idea of what may be going on beneath the surface of this mystery, but no proof. You would be my eyes and ears within the house, talk to the servants, observe the family. I believe this unhappy case goes much deeper than we have so far been led to believe. With your help, we may be able to shed light on the affair before anything unfortunate and irreversible befalls an innocent.
I paled at the detective's words, and John placed a protective hand over my forearm.
Holmes,
He said.
I have no objection to Mary helping this unfortunate family in their time of need, but you must give me your word that there is no danger to her in your plan.
The two friends looked at each other with the utmost seriousness, and I thought for a moment that I could detect a slightly hurt expression on Mr. Holmes's face.
My dear Watson,
He said, his voice rich with a depth of feeling that I had seldom heard from him.
you should know that I would rather cut off my right hand than place someone so important to you in peril. You have my word that no harm will come to Mrs. Watson in the Waterford household.
John nodded and looked down as I covered his hand with my own.
I'm sorry, Holmes.
He said.
I'm sure you understand, though. I had to ask.
Mr. Holmes flashed John a quick, mercurial smile that did not reach his eyes, and nodded back.
Indeed.
He said.
The only danger now is to the infant and possibly to the kidnapper himself if my suppositions are correct.
To the kidnapper? I exclaimed, surprised.
Yes, to the kidnapper. However, I do not want to bias you, so I will say no more about it until we have some hard facts.
He rubbed his hands together briskly.
Now let us dispense with speculation and commence with gathering data. Watson, here is a slip of paper with the Waterford's address and a list of questions to which I should like to have the answers. While you are there, perhaps you would be good enough to offer up Mrs. Watson's services to the family. Please send the results of your interview onto Baker Street. I will check in there from time to time tonight as I am able. I needn't stress that time is of the essence,
He added grimly.
The well-being of a young child may very well hang in the balance.
We both murmured our assent, and Mr. Holmes took his leave. My husband sent a boy out to call for a cab, and I hurried to make up a cold sandwich for John to take with him. Within minutes, he was kissing my cheek and hurrying out the door, and I found myself alone in the house, waiting. Chapter 3. It was very late when John finally returned that night. The Waterfords, as it turned out, were almost pathetically grateful for my offer of help with their daughter, and I was to travel there as soon as I was able in the morning, to start. We were both of us unable to sleep, with the case being very much on our minds, so John told me the gist of the nurse's testimony regarding the kidnapping. Apparently, the nurse, a portly woman by the name of Mrs. Johnson, was taking advantage of the unseasonably warm spring weather to take the colicky child for a brief stroll around the grounds during the early morning hours. Mr. Waterford had not been completely dismissive of Mr. Holmes's admonitions, it seemed, since the nurse was accompanied by one of the stable lads for protection. Nonetheless, the pair was surprised by a single assailant as they passed a large tree. The man, who the nurse described as being short and stocky with worn clothes and a handkerchief tied around the lower part of his face, hit the poor stable boy over the head with a heavy stick, rendering him insensate. He threatened Mrs. Johnson with a knife, forcing her away from the pram and scooping up the child before fleeing into the trees behind the house. It took several minutes for the nurse's screams to summon help at that early hour, and although members of the household were able to follow the man's tracks through the wood, they lost the trail when he emerged onto the main roads and disappeared into the city. The police had no leads as yet, and Mrs. Waterford was so distraught that John could learn nothing of import from her. He had, at Mr. Holmes's behest, discovered a few more details about the birth and the baby's health, thanks to the status afforded to him by virtue of being a doctor. Not only had Mrs. Waterford been bedridden and in seclusion for the last several months of her pregnancy, but she had no milk. Mrs. Johnson was not merely a nursemaid, she was a wet nurse. When questioned, the poor lady spoke at length about how thin and sickly the child seemed when she first entered the Waterfords' employ. He was finally gaining a bit of strength, only to be so ruthlessly ripped from his home and family. It was heartbreaking, and I freely admit to being grateful for John's comforting embrace as we lay in bed that night, contemplating the horrible situation. I knew that I must not allow my feelings to intrude too far into the investigation of the crime, but it was difficult not to identify with a woman who had laboured so hard and long to bring a child into the world, only to lose it in such a cruel manner. My own child, rest its soul, had not made it nearly so far, of course. Scarcely had I become aware of my condition and shared the happy news with John, it seemed, when the cramps and blood of a miscarriage had ended my immediate dreams of a family. For all of John's reassurance that such occurrences were common and would have no bearing on future pregnancies, I could tell that he was almost as affected by grief as I. Knowing how hard it was to lose a child, even at that early stage, I could barely imagine what it must be like to lose a newborn in such a shocking and unexpected way. As dawn broke after a restless night, I rose wearily and began to ready myself for the journey to Mr. Waterford's home. At least, I told myself, I could help lighten the burden on the household by looking after the older daughter. And if I could shed any light on Mr. Holmes's investigation at the same time, well, all the better. Four Oaks was a well-appointed home on the outskirts of London. Upon my arrival, I was greeted by the mistress of the house, who thanked me profusely for my offer of help. Olivia Waterford was a slender woman with dark hair and frightened blue eyes. She was naturally fair-skinned, but it was apparent that her current pallor had more to do with circumstances than natural attributes. She grasped my hand in both of her trembling ones as she spoke, and I made every effort to project a calm and reassuring demeanour. Before long, I was sent up with the housekeeper to meet the Waterfords' 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. The young girl was a tiny version of her mother, and I was soon engaged with her in her studies. She had obviously been affected by the events surrounding her brother's abduction, but she was at heart a charming and well-mannered child, and a pleasure to be around. I did my best to distract her from her family's troubles, and the morning passed quickly enough. Around noon, I sent the girl off for her lunch and went in search of some company and the gossip that Mr. Holmes wanted. I passed an informative hour with the servants over a simple meal. As a group, they were in melancholy spirits, as was to be expected. As was universally true among servants, however, they were also eager to share the details of their recent troubles with a new face. I set out to lend a sympathetic ear to anything they might wish to say, and before the meal was over, I had learned that the missing baby had been the answer to Mr. Waterford's prayer for a son and heir after all hope of a second child in the marriage had nearly been abandoned. Mrs. Waterford counted 38 years and had not been able to get pregnant since Elizabeth was born, almost 10 years previously. Doctors had warned her that at her age, another baby was unlikely, so the announcement that she was with child seemed like a wonderful gift. She was kept under close observation by a new doctor, a specialist brought in from Manchester specifically to help with the pregnancy and birth. And indeed, when she was only a few months along, he determined that she must adhere to strict bed rest and seclusion or risk losing the pregnancy. From that point on, only Dr. Rumsford, the specialist, and Mrs. Waterford's personal maid, Ruth, were allowed access to her room. At the mention of Ruth, there were several rolled eyes and looks of disdain around the table. "I gather Ruth is not a particularly well-liked person," I said in a wry tone. Molly, the sharp-faced, brown-haired scullery maid, spoke up after a moment of uncomfortable silence.
"She gave little Annabel Jenkins the sack on the very day that the baby was born."
The young woman's voice was rough with scorn.
"Annabel only wanted to ask a question about laundering the sheets from the birthing bed. It wasn't right."
There was a general rumble of agreement and nodding of heads. Something about the story tickled the back of my mind, but I put it aside to consider later. Whatever the details, it was apparent that Ruth was solely responsible for her mistress's care through the later stages of pregnancy. Even Mrs. Waterford's husband was barred from her side, on the premise that his worry for her might cause her further upset and distress. There was great relief in the household when the baby was finally born, though there was some concern at first that the child would not survive. As the luncheon gathering of servants broke up, I approached Molly quietly. "Molly," I began, "I was very sorry to hear about your friend Annabel. Has she been able to find another position?"
No, ma'am,
said Molly.
she went back to stay with her old Nan.
"Could you tell me where they live?" I asked, thinking that I might like to speak with the girl. "I have a friend who might be able to offer her a position." Molly's eyes shone.
That's very kind of you, ma'am.
I took down the address that Molly gave me and salved my pricking conscience by silently promising to ask Mrs. Forrester if she had a position open for a maid. The rest of the day proceeded without incident, and I hurried to compose a written report for Mr. Holmes as soon as I was able to leave in the evening, summarizing what I had learned. That night, as I was waiting for John to return from a late call on a sick child, I received a concise reply. "These are murky waters," it read. "Not everyone in the house is telling the truth. Trust only those facts which you can verify independently." I shivered, picturing Mrs. Waterford's haunted blue eyes. I make no claims to any insight as clear as that of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, but after another restless night, I fancied that I could see flashes of a pattern, like a child's wooden puzzle slotting together. I passed a second day in the Waterford house, caring for Elizabeth, and keeping my eyes and ears open for whatever bits of information came my way. Making my departure as early as possible that evening, I took a cab to the end of the dilapidated and woebegone street where the unfortunate Annabel lived with her grandmother. The reluctant cabby tried to dissuade me from alighting, before eventually shaking his head resignedly at my determination and accepting the payment I thrust at him. The address took me to a shabby door, warped almost out of its frame, half hidden in a recess behind a fishmonger's stall. I felt eyes watching me from the shadows and alleys, and suppressed a shiver in the cool, humid evening air. I knocked loudly, and was answered by a short, stooped woman with piercing brown eyes and salt and pepper hair, pulled back in a messy bun.
"What do you want?"
she asked in a curt voice, eyeing my clean, respectable clothing with an air of mistrust. "May I speak to Annabel?" I asked. A slender girl who barely came up to my shoulders appeared behind the woman, clutching a dish towel in her hands.
"I'm Annabel,"
she said softly.
"What can I do for you, ma'am?"
"I have some questions about what happened on the day that the Waterford son was born," I answered. There was a momentary silence.
"I suppose you had better come inside,"
said the older woman grudgingly. After I'd been ensconced in the home's cramped kitchen with a cup of tea, I began to tease the story from the shy girl seated across the table. Annabel had been the newest and youngest servant in the Waterfords' household, and as such the least pleasant tasks often fell to her. Early on the morning in question, she and all of the other servants had been roused from bed by the long-awaited news that Mrs. Waterford was about to give birth. Annabel, excited and worried, had taken every opportunity to go past the mistress's room as the day wore on, hoping for a tidbit of news or gossip to take back to the others.
"It was so quiet, though,"
she said.
"Every time my old mum had another baby, you could hear her grunting and yelling for hours.
She looked down and to the side, half hiding her face.
It was only the last time that she went all quiet, like, and then the midwife came out and told us she and the baby both died."
My heart went out to the girl, but she shrugged off my expression of sympathy.
"Anyway,"
she continued,
"I was worried, so when I saw Ruth come out into the hall, I asked her if the mistress was all right. Instead of answering, she sent me back below stairs with a flea in my ear. I thought the worst must have happened, but a couple of hours later, Mr. Granger, the butler, said that she'd had a baby boy and sent me back up to see to the soiled sheets from the mistress's bed. Ruth wouldn't let me inside the room. She just sort of shoved the sheets into my arms in a bundle. I took them down to the laundry, but when I got there, I thought maybe she had made a mistake. These weren't no sheets that a woman had birthed on, ma'am. They were wet and stained, sure enough, but it was just water and a bit of port wine."
I couldn't stop my surprised reaction, and Annabel nodded vigorously at me.
"I know,"
she said, building steam.
"Well, I marched right back up and asked if there were more sheets to be cleaned, because those just had a bit of port spilled on them, and Ruth practically dragged me away by the ear. Said there was no room in the house for nosy girls and gave me the sack on the spot. It didn't make any sense, I only asked a question.
My mind was buzzing. I quickly concluded the interview, promising to try to find Annabel a position with my former employer. I left to the sounds of her effusive gratitude, distracted by the thoughts whirling in my head. So complete was my absorption that I had gone some little distance back toward the main road before I noticed the two shabbily dressed men following me far too closely to be proper. No sooner had I turned to confront them than the pair blocked my path and bundled me into the shadows of an alleyway. I drew breath to scream, but a foul, meaty hand slapped over my mouth, its owner easily dodging my attempts to kick out at his shins or stamp on his toe.
"Oh, no, you don't, my girl,"
he said in a rough, amused voice, pressing me back against the filthy wall, ignoring my attempts to push him away.
"Now what's a bright little birdie like you doing in this part of town, flitting around our little patch?"
Chapter 4. I will confess that my heart was, in fact, fluttering as fast as a bird's. My captor's friend sniggered in amusement, off to the side. The man restraining me continued, apparently not expecting an answer, since his stinking hand continued to cover the lower half of my face, making it nearly impossible to breathe, let alone speak.
"Never mind, little birdie. We'll just be relieving you of your money and your jewellery before we send you on your way. Consider it a donation to those less fortunate than your fine self."
Pretty little thing, though, isn't she, Georgie?
The other man said in a high, snivelling voice, and my heart beat even faster.
"That she is, Chaz,"
Georgie replied. I jerked and struggled anew, shoving clenched fists against the man's chest, but I could not move him an inch. He leaned in, leering at me, his face wavering as my watering eyes lost focus. Suddenly, there was a puff of air as something large and fast-moving crashed into the one called Chaz, who cried out in surprise and pain. Seizing my chance, I bit down on the smothering hand over my mouth as hard as I could. Georgie cursed as I reached up, raking clawed fingers across his eyes, feeling my fingernails dig into skin. The hands pinning me fell away, and I stumbled clear at the same moment a stout walking stick landed on the side of the man's head with a solid thud, felling him. Dizzy and terrified, I righted myself with both hands on the wall, ready to run from this new threat. In front of me, breathing heavily, stood Sherlock Holmes, dressed as a common labourer, and with a tempestuous look upon his dark brow.
"What were you thinking?"
he said. I gaped at him in a most unladylike manner for several seconds before blurting out, "Mrs. Waterford did not give birth. The baby is not hers."
"Of course the baby is not the Waterfords,"
he practically thundered.
"That much has been apparent since the kidnapping. And now, Mrs. Watson, I repeat, what were you thinking?"
"You said to trust only those facts which I could verify independently," I said, mind still trying to catch up to the situation. Mr. Holmes's mouth opened and closed a few times, no sound emerging.
"And so you decided to come to the East End, unaccompanied, to verify a fact?"
he asked eventually.
"Do you have any idea what Watson would—"
He broke off abruptly.
"No, never mind.
He interrupted himself.
We must get you back to where you belong. Are you injured?"
I shook my head. "I don't think so. Merely winded and in some disarray." I attempted to put myself to rights, but nothing would hide the streaks of filth from the alley wall now marring my dress. I could only hope that John would still be out battling the tide of London's fevers and sniffles when I arrived home.
"Come then,"
said Mr. Holmes, and escorted me back out to the main road, where he eventually flagged down a questionable-looking cab. Reining himself in with an obvious effort, Mr. Holmes explained that he had been on the way to interview Annabel in the guise of a gardener who had been ill-treated in by the staff at Four Oaks, hoping to capitalise on the fellow feeling between wronged servants. It was mere luck that he had happened on the commotion, as the two roughs had pulled me into the alley, and managed to surprise them. He dismissed my attempted thanks with a testy wave, and proceeded to interrogate me about the details of my conversation with the little maid. When I got to the part about the port-stained sheets, he tutted softly.
"Sloppy work for a doctor,"
he said.
"Very sloppy indeed."
By this time, we were approaching Cavendish Place, and I broached the subject that had been foremost on my mind. "You said you already knew that the infant was not the Waterfords. Have you solved the case? Do you know what is happening in that house and who has the child? Mr. Holmes pressed his lips together into a thin, unhappy line.
Yes and no. Mrs. Waterford, in her desperation to have another child, has deceived her husband, and almost everyone else as well. I fear that she has obtained an infant from a most dangerous and unfortunate source, and in doing so has placed several people in serious peril.
He said.
Mrs. Watson, may I prevail upon you to ask your husband if he will accompany me tomorrow? I may need his assistance in bringing this matter to a close.
My stomach gave a little thrill of fear at his grim tone, but I immediately assured him that I would.
Thank you,
he replied.
I will call at 8 in the morning to pick him up, assuming he is amenable.
The cab was pulling up in front of the door, and I looked at Mr. Holmes earnestly. There is no need to speak of this evening's events to John, is there? I asked. You know he will only worry. The detective frowned.
What you and he speak of between yourselves or do not speak of is your own concern. I see no reason to broach the subject myself.
He paused.
If your husband were to find out that you had placed yourself in danger while attempting to do my bidding, worry is not the word I would use to describe his probable reaction. Perhaps towering rage, or possibly grievous bodily harm to a detective, but not worry.
I let out the breath I'd been holding. In that case, I said, I think we understand each other. I alit from the cab and bade Mr. Holmes a good night, entering the house quietly, only to find to my relief that John was still out, tending patients. By the time he arrived 45 minutes later, weary and footsore, I was wearing a clean dress, face scrubbed, and putting together a cold supper for him. He kissed my cheek and listened with interest to my slightly edited description of the day's events, his eyes sparking with the thrill of the hunt when I passed on Mr. Holmes's request for his presence the following day.
I'll send a note to Anstruther asking him to take my patients as soon as I finish eating,
he said, and tucked into his cold roast fowl. The following morning dawned grey and chill. As I bustled around, readying myself for another day at Four Oaks, John dressed and breakfasted before returning to the desk in his study and removing his service revolver from the top drawer. He checked it quickly and deposited it in his coat pocket. I tamped down on the familiar feeling of worry that arose in my chest, saying nothing. At 8 o'clock sharp, a rented trap pulled by a sleek chestnut mare drew up to the front door, Mr. Holmes himself at the reins.
We may need to cover quite a bit of ground today, old chap,
he said in response to John's questioning look.
However, as our first stop will be to interview the Waterfords once more, you are welcome to join us, Mrs. Watson.
I thanked him and allowed John to hand me up into the trap, making room for him next to me and settling my shawl more snugly around my shoulders to ward off the chill. Once we were both ensconced, Mr. Holmes applied the whip to the mare's rump and we set off at a brisk pace.
Are you familiar with the Infant Life Protection Act of 1872, Watson?
He asked when we were underway.
It deals with the supervision of lying-in houses, among other things.
John darted a quick glance in my direction, looking slightly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat.
Not specifically, no. I am aware, of course, that such places must be registered with the authorities and are governed by strict rules, though I'm not sure this is an appropriate subject to discuss in the presence of a lady.
I cut him off, wanting to hear as much as possible about the case. John, I am fully aware of the existence of such places. Most young women are. Pray, continue, Mr. Holmes. I did not add that I had become aware of the boarding houses that took in pregnant, unmarried girls and women, and later cared for their infants for a fee, after a single, youthful indiscretion had made me fear that my virtue was destroyed forever. Fortunately, I had escaped the most damning consequences of my folly, and vowed never to repeat my unfortunate mistake until I was a married woman.
Thank you, and please forgive my tactlessness on the matter,
said Holmes.
At any rate, the Infant Life Protection Act is something of a national scandal. It was a response to the frankly shameful conditions in which many unwanted infants were kept, fed watered-down milk laced with lime and laudanum until they died of starvation, allowing the owners of the lying-in houses to make a profit on the money garnered from the infants' mothers for their care.
A queasy feeling came over me. And this type of abuse was common in such places. I could not stop myself from asking.
Was, and still is, I'm afraid. As I said, the Act is a legislative embarrassment, a singular example of the government being seen to take action on a problem without actually taking any action. Responsibility for upholding it falls to the Metropolitan Board of Works, the same body which oversees maintenance of the streets and sewers. As you might imagine, that august organisation is somewhat ill-equipped to inspect houses for the quality of infant care.
The unpleasant feeling in my stomach only worsened, for Mr. Holmes's description differed strongly from the situation that had been described to me as a possible means of salvation after my own indiscretion. I had been ready and willing to entrust an infant of my own to such a place, in order to escape the disastrous consequences of licentiousness on my personal prospects in life. John's next question rescued me from the detective's too knowing glance, though I feared what he might have gleaned already from my reaction.
You told Mary that you believed Mrs. Waterford had faked her pregnancy and obtained an infant to continue the ruse. I assume that you believe she got the child from one of these lying-in houses, but if that's the case, why would they kidnap him? Surely she paid to get the boy in the first place, and such an operation would be quite happy to have one less mouth to feed.
No doubt they were,
said Holmes.
but the kidnapper did not come from the lying-in house.
After that, the detective refused to say any more until we arrived at Four Oaks and were shown into the drawing-room. Mrs. Waterford entered some moments later, looking, if possible, even more pale and wan than the last time I had seen her. As soon as the maid left, closing the door behind her, Holmes stepped forward and said,
I know your secret. This attempted deception of your husband may cost 2 lives unless you tell me right now where you obtained the infant.
Mrs. Waterford's eyes grew huge, and the remaining blood drained from her face in an instant. John and I rushed forward in tandem as her knees buckled, supporting her between us and easing her down onto a nearby divan. She leaned over, breathing deeply and clutching my hand for a moment before looking up to meet the detective's hard gaze. Chapter 5.
I didn't know,
she said softly.
I didn't know what I was getting into. I'd been corresponding with Dr. Rumsford in Manchester to see if anything could be done to correct my inability to bear more children. Henry has been so desperate for a son he'd almost given up hope, and it hurt me so to see him in mourning for something he'd never even had.
But this Dr. Rumsford offered you an alternative,
suggested Mr. Holmes. The woman nodded.
He told me I could adopt a baby in need. It would be a good deed, a selfless act. I had some money of my own, an inheritance from my uncle. I used part of it to pay the adoption fee and to reimburse Dr. Rumsford for his help. He planned everything, told me how we should do it. But the baby he brought me was so sick I was afraid he wouldn't survive. And now, oh God, it's all gone so terribly wrong.
She began to sob softly, still holding my hand in both of hers. I was torn between empathy for her obvious suffering and horror at the magnitude of the deception she had attempted to perpetrate against her own husband, and indeed the world at large. Mr. Holmes, however, was not so easily sidetracked from his goal.
I will not begin to address the moral implications of what you have done here,
he said coldly.
It may be possible to prevent the full scope of the damage that could yet be done. However, to do so, I need you to tell me where you got the child, and I need you to tell me now.
I never had any direct contact with the individuals in question,
said Mrs. Waterford.
But the cheque for the adoption was made out to Mrs. Horace Dyer.
The detective's features hardened further.
Thank you, Mrs. Waterford,
he said.
Mrs. Watson, please stay here and attend to the lady and her daughter. Doctor, I fear we must move quickly.
John reached over to squeeze my hand briefly.
I'm right behind you, old man,
he said, and they were both gone, leaving me with the tearful woman, her soft sobs and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the only sounds breaking the suddenly eerie silence of the large house. After I calmed Mrs. Waterford somewhat and returned her to the care of her servants, it was all I could do to focus on my duties as governess for the rest of the day. John had not returned when I arrived home at 6, or when I finally set my book of poetry aside at 9:45. I had nearly resigned myself to a restless night of worry when I heard the creak of the front door and the slow, slightly uneven tread of my husband climbing the stairs. "John?" I asked into the darkness.
I'm here, Mary. I'm all right.
He answered in a tired voice.
Well, except for a handful of bruises and scrapes.
I sat up, reaching for him. I could get some hot water and antiseptic, I said.
No.
He answered immediately, sitting on the bed.
It's fine.
I heard him shed his jacket and shoes, and then he was climbing under the covers with me, still mostly dressed, smelling of dirt and sweat. His arms went around me, holding me tightly to his own body, and I responded in kind, unsure if he was giving comfort or receiving it. "Did you find the baby?" I asked hesitantly, fearing the worst.
I'm not certain.
He said after a moment's pause.
I hope so. We'll know in the morning.
Moments later, he dropped into a restless sleep, punctuated with dreams. I did not follow him into slumber for many hours. At this point, I must make a confession in the interests of full disclosure. For the most part, John shares with me all of the particulars regarding his involvement in cases with Sherlock Holmes. Very occasionally, however, he will beg my forgiveness on the basis of a situation being either too upsetting or too sensitive for him to share with anyone, even me. While I certainly cannot claim not to be curious about such instances, I respect my husband's judgment in such matters and leave well enough alone. Perhaps it is because I was personally involved in so much of the Waterford case that I could not seem to let it go, even though I already knew the beginning, most of the middle, and the end of the story. Still, I'm afraid to say that my desire to know the details of the denouement eventually overcame my sense of ethical behavior. My husband is a compulsive writer and biographer. He has a constitutional inability to leave an adventure undocumented, even if it will never see the light of publication. This is in stark contrast to my own, less organized scribblings, which tend to be limited to events which have a deep impact on me personally. However, whereas he, so far as I'm aware, does not even know that I keep a diary, I know all about the tin dispatch box full of notes in the lumber room, and the slightly rusty key lying in the back of the second drawer of his writing desk. It is, therefore, with a sense of shame that I admit to having opened said box and read John's account of that day in mid-May. At any rate, what's done is done, and I reproduce those notes here verbatim, in all of their shocking detail.
As the trap pulled away from Four Oaks, I attempted once more to draw Holmes out on the subject of the kidnapper, asking him again who would have a motive for taking the child.
"Why, Watson?"
he replied.
"It was one of the two people whom you would expect to take an interest in an infant. It was the baby's father, obviously."
Of course, I exclaimed, suddenly remembering the contents of the threatening note Holmes had examined. The one which read, "Mrs. Give back what you have stole from us."
"Indeed,"
Holmes continued.
"It remains to be seen why he did not simply marry the infant's mother if he was so enamored of the idea of having a family, but it is fairly obvious that he did not agree with her decision to give up the child. For all his tempestuous nature, he must be a fairly resourceful and intelligent individual to have traced his son to the Forrester household."
"Wait, Holmes," I said. "If the father has the baby, why were you so insistent about getting the name of the owner of the lying-in house?"
"Do try to keep up, Watson. Mrs. Horace Dyer has every reason to want the current situation, shall we say, contained. While the present system is quite anemic when it comes to enforcement, what she is doing is still unlawful in the extreme, and the last thing she wants is to have a disgruntled father bringing accusations and scandal to her doorstep."
"But what is it that you expect her to do?" I pressed.
"I expect her to tell her husband."
Holmes answered grimly, pulling the mare to a halt in front of a small telegraph office.
"Mr. Horace Dyer of the infamous Dyer gang, specialist in smuggling, larceny, assault, blackmail, and, apparently, a bit of baby farming on the side."
"You fear that this miscreant will add murder to his repertoire as a means of keeping the father quiet," I concluded.
"I do,"
Holmes replied, alighting from the trap.
"And now I must wire Gregson to meet us at Mrs. Dyer's establishment with reinforcements. Thankfully, the house in question is one of the 39 such places I identified around London during the course of my investigation, which speeds the process along immensely."
Holmes disappeared inside and returned less than 5 minutes later whipping up the mare as we drove away from the pleasant area surrounding Four Oaks and toward the less savoury East End. We were quiet, except for Holmes' occasional curses when the increasingly heavy traffic slowed even further. I checked my revolver a final time, hoping that I would not have need of it inside what would presumably be a building full of sick and abused infants. By the time we arrived, I was relieved to see that a small platoon of police had already gathered, huddled around 3 Black Marias. Gregson himself detached from the knot of officers and approached us to confer with Holmes. Within 15 minutes, the police had the building surrounded, and Holmes and I stood to one side as Gregson pounded on the door, demanding entry. When there was no answer, he gestured to a pair of burly fellows to force the door, and we all swarmed inside. Moving room to room, we subdued any person we came across, including one scoundrel who swung for my head with a broken plank, only to crumple to the ground under the force of Holmes's walking stick. The last room we came to will live on in my dreams. Shabby cots filled every available space, leaving only narrow walkways between. Almost every cot held a spindly, sunken-cheeked infant wrapped in dirty swaddling. The silence was the worst part, however. Where one would expect the noise and confusion of the police raid to inspire loud crying and wailing, there was only the occasional weak whimper, as if the poor babes had no expectation of succor from their caretakers and no strength left to protest their situation. Holmes joined me inside the doorway. He reached for the side of the nearest cot, examining a piece of cardstock pinned to the rough wood.
They've kept records on the individual infants,
he said evenly.
Good.
I turned to him to berate him for his lack of empathy in the face of this gross abuse, but stopped myself at the sight of his pale, angry face. Instead, I called for Gregson and began making a list of the supplies needed for upwards of 50 starving babies under the age of 2 months. It was late at night before I felt able to leave, confident that the handful of police constables and volunteers from a nearby church would be able to handle the situation overnight, armed with clean diapers and gallons of Dr. Roch's latest infant formula mix. Nevertheless, I did not sleep well that night.
Chapter 6. The following morning, John left very early. I returned to Four Oaks to find the house in an odd state of nervous tension. Ignorant as I was at the time of the previous night's goings-on, I had to get what news there was from the staff.
They say Mr. Holmes may have found the baby,
Molly told me as soon as she could get me alone.
Ruth and the master and mistress have gone to identify him. Mrs. Johnson said she heard that the kidnappers were keeping dozens of babies in a big house, and they're going to look at all of them and see if he's there. She said it would be easy to find him on account of he has a little birthmark on his chest in the shape of an upside-down heart.
That is exciting news, I replied. I certainly hope they are successful in their search.
Me too,
the girl said earnestly.
I wish they'd get back, though. It's been hours since they left.
As if Molly's words had conjured them, the main doors were flung open to reveal Ruth ushering her mistress forward, with Henry Waterford hanging back a few steps, frowning. Mrs. Waterford was clutching a small bundle to her chest, and Molly and I dodged to the side as a sobbing Mrs. Johnson all but ran past us in the hallway, hurrying nimbly down the stairway like a much younger woman until she could examine the crying infant in its mother's arms. Olivia Waterford was weeping as well, as she handed the infant to his nurse and tenderly moved the blanket away from his face. Mrs. Johnson kissed the downy head over and over, murmuring apologies and endearments as the 2 women, flanked by Ruth, disappeared toward the nursery in the back of the house. Next to me, Molly was also crying openly, wiping her cheeks with her apron, and I confess my own eyes were none too dry. My heart sank, however, as my attention returned to Mr. Waterford, who had remained unmoving through the entire reunion. Obviously, he had been informed of his wife's deception, and I wondered what he would choose to do about it. I could little afford to dwell on the matter, however. The rest of my morning was spent with Elizabeth, ensuring that the daughter was not completely neglected while the family was so wrapped up in the return of the baby. I took her to see him for a few minutes and struggled to hide my dismay at the poor babe's weak and frail condition. The girl seemed oddly unworried, and it occurred to me that he had probably looked like that, if not worse, for most of the time she had known him. Still, Mrs. Johnson had succeeded in nursing him to health once. Thinking of Henry Waterford's imposing face, I hoped she would have a chance to do so again. When I returned home, there was a note from Mr. Holmes waiting in the afternoon post. John would not be back for hours yet, so I opened it, telling myself that at this point I was as much a part of this case as my husband was. "Body of child's father washed up on shores of Thames," it said. "Have contacted mother to appear at 221B Baker Street tomorrow at 10 a.m. should you care to be present for the denouement of this sad little morality play." It was at this point that the identity of the kidnapper and the final few pieces of the puzzle slotted into place in my mind, and I knew that I had to be present for that interview. While the precise details of this young woman's downfall might well be different than mine, in broad terms, I had come very close to travelling in her shoes. How would she react when she found out her infant's fate? Had she assumed he was safe and cared for? Had she missed him, wanted him back? Perhaps it was a form of self-flagellation, but for better or worse, I had to know this woman's mind. Of course, convincing John that I should accompany him was something else. Finally, since I could hardly share my real reasons for wanting to be there, I resorted to batting my eyelashes and telling him that a scared young woman might be more inclined to open up about her past in the presence of a sympathetic female face. He relented, though uneasily. And so it was that we once again found ourselves in John's old rooms, sitting in front of the fireplace while Mr. Holmes completed his now familiar last-minute ablutions down the hall. I pondered the detective's quickly hidden expression of surprise at my presence when he first opened the door for us at 9:45, followed by what appeared to be a glimmer of respect. Once again, I wondered how much he had gleaned about my history during the past few days. I forced myself to sit quietly rather than fidgeting, determined to give the man no further clues to the misadventures of my youth. After he returned, I relayed my impressions of the Waterford household's reaction to the return of the child, including Mr. Waterford's cold response, as we waited for the infant's mother to arrive.
Perhaps not a surprising response to such a major deception on the part of one's wife,
said Holmes, lounging against the mantelpiece with his pipe grasped in one hand.
The gentleman in question had only just been informed that what he thought was his son and heir was in fact a random waif, the offspring of a butcher's son and a young woman of loose morals, no less.
I felt John bristle slightly, reflecting the feeling behind my own raised eyebrow.
None of which is the fault of the child,
he said.
Indeed not.
Mr. Holmes agreed, readily enough.
However, you can hardly argue against the perceived importance of blood and lineage, especially to the rich.
And yet, the child that was returned to them yesterday is the same child on which he doted days earlier, I could not help saying. Nothing has changed.
I would hypothesize that the change is to his perception of his wife as much as his perception of his child.
John said gently,
but it's possible things will still work themselves out for the best.
Ah, my dear Watson,
Holmes said,
ever the bastion of faith in human nature. I wish I had a fraction of your belief in the goodness of men. Sadly, I have spent too long amongst the dregs of humanity to continue to support such notions, but here is the knock of our visitor. Perhaps I will find myself pleasantly surprised.
The young woman at the door was thin, and her dress shabby, but she held herself proudly upright and met Mr. Holmes's eyes with a clear, direct gaze as he bade her enter. She was young, certainly not more than 16 or 17 years old.
Thank you for coming, Miss Burke,
he said.
Do please have a seat by the fire.
If it's all the same to you, sir, I'd rather stand,
Miss Burke said.
You said you had news of Peter Hutchins and his infant son. Tell me what it is, and I'll be on my way.
As you wish,
said Mr. Holmes, his voice cool.
Peter Hutchins was found murdered yesterday after kidnapping his young son from the household which had recently adopted him. The infant was recovered safely from the same lying-in house to which you, as his mother, originally farmed him out 4 weeks ago. It is to be assumed that the gang that ran the house was responsible for young Master Hutchins' death. The members have, for the most part, been captured and taken into custody.
Miss Burke blanched as the detective finished his recitation of the facts, and I saw John tense in readiness to step forward and support her, should she swoon. Within seconds, though, she steadied herself, a flush of anger colouring her pale cheeks.
It's no more than he deserves, the half-witted cad,
she said.
Curse him, and curse that bastard child of his. Ruined my life, the pair of them.
I could not help but be shocked by the angry outburst, and John looked deeply uncomfortable. Mr. Holmes, however, only raised an eyebrow.
Hardly half-witted,
said the detective.
Indeed, I still have not determined how he was able to trace the child to the home into which he had been adopted. I believe he was able to inveigle himself into the lying-in house under the guise of making deliveries for his father's butcher shop, and once there, rifle through the documentation on the infants that the gang kept as potential blackmail material. However, it is not clear to me how he knew to find the right lying-in house in the first place.
Miss Burke made an ugly noise that might have been a laugh.
No wits involved in that, were there? He came to my boarding house and forced me to tell him. He's been hounding me since the day I refused to marry him. I couldn't get away. Every time I'd move, he'd just find me again a month later.
Forgive me, I asked, but if you knew that you were with child, why would you refuse to marry him? The prospects of a butcher's son may not be grand, but they aren't poor either. Would that not have been a much easier road? Angry brown eyes turned their attention to me.
He was a drunkard and a brute. Maybe you'd be content to tie yourself to a lout who let his fists do most of his talking for him. But I'm not.
I felt the blush of embarrassment rise to my cheeks, but I forced myself to hold eye contact as I replied, I am sorry. I shouldn't have made assumptions.
No, ma'am, you shouldn't have,
said the young woman, giving no quarter.
I didn't ask to be the girl that took his fancy. I didn't ask him to start chasing after me, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. He had it all worked out in his head how he was going to marry me, and he was going to bed me, and just because I wanted something different, he wasn't going to let that stop him. When I fell pregnant, I knew I had to get away. He thought it would scare me into marrying him, but I'd rather have died than try to raise a child with him and his drink and his hard fists. So I ran and hid the pregnancy for as long as I could. When I couldn't anymore, I went to the lying-in house, and later I boarded the child with Mrs. Dyer. Cost me 3/4 of my wages every week, that did.
And did you never think to check on the boy?
John asked, a tinge of angry colour touching his cheeks.
Did it not bother you that they were starving him?
He would have starved with me as well.
Miss Burke shouted back at him, fists clenched.
No one would hire an unmarried girl with a baby in tow. We both would have starved. I'm practically starving now.
Mr. Holmes rose smoothly between them and spoke in a calm voice.
I take it then that you have no interest in making a claim on the infant. There are written records that would back up such a claim should you wish to pursue it.
Are you mad?
Said Miss Burke.
I can finally see my way clear of this nightmare, and you ask if I want to make a claim. I never want to see the little bastard again. Let him live out his life with this posh new family, and hope for their sakes that he doesn't have too much of his father in him. Our business here is done, sir. I'm leaving now.
Very well,
Mr. Holmes said evenly.
Allow me to show you to the door.
Miss Burke, I said quickly, rising from my seat as she began to turn away. I wish you the best of luck in your endeavours. I'm sorry this has befallen you.
Keep your luck and your sympathy, ma'am,
said the girl.
I've no use for either of 'em.
She marched out the door, head held high, but I am certain I made out the glitter of tears in her eyes before the detective ushered her down the stairs. I looked at John, only to find him examining me in return.
You are too gentle with someone who would hold such a precious life in her arms only to thrust it away,
he said. There was no anger behind his words, and I could practically hear the silent continuation.
When others long for such a life, only to have it ripped away before it properly began.
Perhaps so, dear heart, I said, taking his hand. Perhaps so. Chapter 7. The next morning was a Sunday, so I did not return to Four Oaks until the following day. I arrived with some trepidation, unsure of what I would find. The morning was bright and warm, and I hoped against hope that it presaged a happy ending in one corner of this unhappy story. I had scarcely entered the back hallway when little Elizabeth ran up to me with a broad smile and a clatter of shoe heels on wood.
"Ma'am, come and see. My brother is getting better,"
she said in a rush. I allowed myself to be tugged along by the hand until we came to the open door of the nursery. Inside, Mrs. Waterford sat in a rocking chair, cradling the baby who had been at the centre of this strange tale, while Mrs. Johnson stood behind and to one side, beaming. Leaving me at the door, Elizabeth ran up to her mother and brother.
"Mama,"
she said breathlessly,
"Mrs. Watson has come to visit little William."
Olivia Waterford smiled at her daughter, and then, tentatively, at me.
"In that case, you'd better show her in, hadn't you, Elizabeth?"
she said. I entered, crossing to the two women and looking down at the tiny bundle with a smile of my own. Mrs. Waterford rose.
"Here, would you like to hold him?"
she asked, transferring the infant to my waiting arms as I acquiesced. I looked down at the delicate form in my arms, cooing meaningless words as I rocked him gently back and forth. He was still so very frail and thin, but today his pale blue eyes locked onto my face and he waved one tiny arm toward me, small fingers brushing my chin as he burbled happily.
"Mrs. Johnson, Elizabeth,"
Mrs. Waterford said.
"Would you excuse us for a moment? I would like to thank Mrs. Watson for her kind assistance over these past several days."
The others murmured their assent and retired from the room, leaving me alone with the lady of the house. I carefully returned William to her outstretched arms, while covering my mild discomfort at being in the presence of someone to whose deepest secrets I was privy. I was not alone in my slight awkwardness. Mrs. Waterford lowered her eyes quickly as she readjusted the baby in her embrace. In an attempt to fill the sudden silence, I said, "There's really no need to thank me, ma'am. I was happy to be of assistance, and Elizabeth is a lovely child."
"It is not your services as governess for which I need to thank you,"
she said, meeting my eyes once more.
"Though those services were indeed deeply appreciated. No, I wish to thank you for securing the services of Mr. Holmes, without whom I would almost certainly never have seen my baby again."
Still feeling my way, I replied, "Nonetheless, I was happy to do it. I only wish that the circumstances had not uncovered so much pain for so many people." It was as close as I could come to apologizing for having been present at the embarrassing interview in which Mr. Holmes had revealed her deception. "I hope that some happiness has come out of the ordeal for you and your family." A slightly wry, slightly sad smile passed over Mrs. Waterford's face, and I felt a moment of relief that I had not offended her.
"As tactful and diplomatic a response as one could imagine, my dear. Thank you,"
she said.
"I think after long hours of discussion with my husband that it shall. Henry is a good man. He dotes on William, and he is too kind-hearted a man to ever blame an infant for the crime of being born. While he may rightly blame me for the deception I perpetrated, I am still his wife, and he is still my husband. He does not have it in him to punish our family for mistakes that cannot now be undone."
"I am very glad to hear it," I replied. "I too know what it is like to wish for a child. I am happy that your wish has been granted, regardless of how it came to be."
"You're young yet,"
she said.
"Don't give up hope. Things will unfold as they are meant to, and I'm confident that your dream will be fulfilled in good time. Now let us find Elizabeth so that you may say your farewells. I know that she will miss your company. You were invaluable to her in this difficult time."
"Thank you. I hope such a need will never arise again, but if it does, please don't hesitate to contact me," I replied. That evening, we dined at Simpson's with Mr. Holmes, a rare social engagement with the largely unsociable man. The detective was flush with the successful conclusion of the high-profile DeLong jewel case, and another involving embezzlement from a well-known steel company. It wasn't long, however, until conversation turned to the Waterford kidnapping. I related my impression that the family in question intended to make the best of the situation, without getting into the particulars of my conversation with Olivia Waterford earlier that day. Mr. Holmes shook his head.
"Better than the alternative, I suppose,"
he said.
"Still, The thing is rotten at both ends and stinks to high heaven in the middle. What news of the other children that were recovered, Watson?
John studied his wineglass for a moment, twirling the stem. I knew he had been working long hours with the police and 2 local churches, attempting to deal with the infants, but I felt a shock of embarrassment and remorse that I had not spared more thought for the other tiny victims in the case, being too wrapped up with the Waterford household's personal woes.
There were 53 infants in the house. 1 was dead when we arrived, and we lost another 6 who were too weak and sick to survive, even with medical care.
John's face was grave, and it was obvious that he considered those failures a personal shortcoming.
That left 45, not counting the little boy adopted by Olivia Waterford. We put out a call to all of the churches and charitable organizations in the area and were able to find adoptive homes for all of the children within days.
Well done, old chap,
said the detective.
And not an undertaking for which I envy you.
John was still focused on his wine, eyebrows drawn together.
It's the hypocrisy, though, Holmes. Suddenly, when it's in the public eye, the great and the good are lining up to take in unwanted infants, eager to lap up the praise for their selfless actions. Meanwhile, who knows how many more helpless babes are languishing in places just as bad or worse. No one knows and no one cares. Out of sight, out of mind.
I sensed and shared the twinge of guilt behind John's words. While we were by no means well off, neither were we destitute by any stretch. We had the means to adopt an unwanted child, but we had never even talked about it. Both of us assumed that we would have a family naturally. Even now, the idea of an adopted infant did not ignite the same pull of longing within me as the thought of a child born of my own body.
And yet,
said Mr. Holmes,
to replicate Mrs. Waterford's ill-considered actions only serves to financially support the criminals running the lying-in houses. It is the system itself that is broken, Watson. Would you not agree?
Perhaps,
John said.
Still, while the fault may lie with the system, it is the children who suffer. There will always be unwanted infants. What kind of world is it where they have no future and their lives are worth nothing?
It is certainly a difficult conundrum, one of many with which humanity wrestles on a daily basis, sadly.
The detective said.
But perhaps it is not all as bleak as it seems. I think Wiggins, for one, would take exception to the idea that his life is worthless.
John huffed a short chuckle.
Yes, I suppose he would. I believe he and the rest of your irregulars are something of a special case, however.
I looked at the detective, suddenly seeing him in a different light than I was accustomed to. It was a shock to recognize that Sherlock Holmes, the cold-blooded reasoner, the human calculating machine, had done more to support children in need, in real, concrete terms, than anyone else I knew. The realization was a sobering one. It seems that widespread change could best be enacted politically, wouldn't you say, Mr. Holmes? I asked. If the current laws governing lying in houses have no teeth, then the laws should be changed.
No doubt, however, I'm afraid that the sphere of politics is more my brother's purview than mine, Mrs. Watson.
The detective demurred. I fear I was not a very good conversationalist for the rest of the meal. My mind was cataloguing a list of acquaintances who might be interested in organising and putting together educational materials regarding the current laws on infant care. I vowed to contact Mrs. Forrester first thing in the morning to discuss it. As John and I lay in bed that night, I absently picked at a corner of the sheet, mind far away.
This is bothering you a great deal,
John said softly, rolling onto his side so that he could wrap an arm around me from behind. It's bothering you too, I responded.
Of course it is. You intend to try and do something about it, don't you? That's why you were asking about changing the laws.
This is what comes of your adventures with Mr. Holmes, I teased, affecting a world-weary tone. Soon you'll be deducing what I had for lunch and how many pairs of stockings I purchased last week.
I don't have to deduce what you had for lunch. I could just ask the maid,
he said.
It is why you are asking, though, isn't it?
I nodded in the dark. Do you disapprove?
Quite the opposite,
John said.
It's a noble goal, though I'm not certain it's an attainable one.
I know, I said, but there's no way to find out without making the attempt. It feels like I should do something. You helped those babies. Even Mr. Holmes has children that he helps.
I didn't do anything that any other doctor wouldn't have done.
Said John. You kept them alive, I said indignantly.
Not all of them.
He said, his voice heavy. All of them that could be saved, I told him firmly.
Do you think we should take in a child ourselves?
He asked. I hesitated. I think we should consider it. I mean, it wouldn't really be as though we were giving up on having our own child, would it? We could still have one.
I've told you,
he said, his arm tightening briefly around my belly.
There's nothing wrong with you. We lost one child, but there will be others. You'll see. Still, adoption is something we should talk about. Not all unwanted children end up lying in houses run by criminals, thank goodness.
Good, I said. A sudden thought occurred to me. Oh, heavens, what would Mr. Holmes say? John chuckled.
I can't even imagine. He'll either run for the hills or attempt to teach it the principles of logic from the crib.
Saints preserve us, I said, unable to stop the warm feeling that flooded my chest, thinking of such a thing. With a guardian such as that, and a father such as John, it would be the luckiest child in England. The end. This has been Sherlock Holmes, The Case of the Magnate's Son, being a reprint from the diary of Mrs. Mary Watson, née Morstan. Written by R.A. Dodson. Digitally narrated by ElevenLabs. Copyright 2016 by Otherlove Publishing LLC. Production copyright 2023 by Otherlove Publishing LLC.